So this is the beginning of Unit 6 on animal physiology, and we're beginning the unit by looking at the nervous system. And in particular, we're going to be looking at the physiology of a nerve impulse. So this is chapter 48 in your textbook, and this will be an overview of the nervous system and a nerve impulse. So beginning, every time you move a muscle or think a thought, your nerve cells are working. They're processing the information. If you really think about it, that involves receiving a signal, deciding what to do with that, and then sending out a new message with a response. So some nerve cells are going to be involved with communicating directly with muscle cells, for example, sending them a signal to contract, or other nerve cells might only spend their lives communicating with other nerve cells, and will their job will be to figure out how to process the information that they're receiving. The processing of this information has one key characteristic, and that is that it has to be really fast. So looking at animals, why do they need a nervous system? There are certain characteristics that are needed in every nervous system, and we already started with the one that it has to be fast, it needs to be accurate, and it needs to reset quickly after each message is sent. So if you were to look at this rabbit here, and you can see it's a snow rabbit with its footprints in the snow, what would happen in the nervous system when that rabbit spots the hawk? And if you had whiteboards, you would maybe draw out what is going on in the nervous system of that rabbit in response to the stimulus of seeing a hawk. So you can pause this and think about that, or we'll just go on. Basically, the nervous system is in the business of detecting an external stimulus and sometimes an internal stimulus, and then transmitting that information to a processing center. So the types of neurons, the cells that are going to be detecting the stimulus, are called sensory neurons. So they provide sensory input. And then that sensory input goes to a processing center. And that processing center for mammals is going to be the brain or the spinal cord, where the interneurons are going to process or integrate the information from the sensory neurons. Then, depending on what type of stimulus it is, there will be a response. And that response is going to come away from the central nervous system, being the brain or the spinal cord, as a motor output. And that's going to be using what we call motor neurons. So the motor output leaves the brain or the ganglia via motor neurons, which will then trigger the response, either a muscle to move or glands to be active. So basically what is involved here is our stimulus is usually going to be coming from a peripheral nerve or the peripheral nervous system, and it's going to be processed within the central nervous system or CNS, and then the response will be back out again through the peripheral nervous system. So as a review, what are the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system? Essentially, a central nervous system, as you, I'm sure, know, consists of the brain and the spinal cord. So this is our central processing. And the peripheral nervous system is everything outside of that. So everything outside of the central nervous system. So how does the information get processed? It takes place in simple clusters of neurons, which are called ganglia. or a more complex organization of neurons called the brain. There are three stages before that processing occurs. So the first stage, again, is going to be that sensory input via a sensory neuron. We also call sensory neurons afferent neurons, and they're part of the central nervous system. Afferent means moving away. Afferent means moving towards a central organ or a central point. So in this case, an afferent neuron is one that is moving towards the central nervous system. Within the central nervous system, we have integration, or what I like to call processing, and that's when the signal is processed and determined what to do with it. And then the third step is going to be the motor output, and this is going to be via motor neurons, which are also known as efferent neurons. Efferent neurons are ones that move away from a central organ or point. So in this case, they're neurons that are moving impulses away from the central nervous system. These motor neurons are going to signal muscle cells again or glands to do some work. So let's look closely at a neuron. So you need to know the different parts of a neuron, and it's pretty simple and should be a review. You can see here a photograph of an actual neuron, where the major portion is the cell body, this blob here. A neuron is an excellent cell to study structure, fitting, function. So for example, at the beginning of the cell, here's the cell body. Within the cell body, we're going to find most of the organelles of the cell. But what is going to be branching off from the cell body are what we call dendrites. And these are the entry points for the signal and the stimulus to enter the cell. So these neurons have lots of dendrites so that there are many entry points for the signal to come into the cell. And the signal's direction is going to be through the dendrites into the cell body. So then the stimulus, the message, is going to continue from the cell body into what is called the axon. So this is the long portion that's attached to the cell body that is carrying the message along. And then where it ends here is called a number of different things for the same structure. So the synaptic terminal is also known as the axon terminal. It's the place where the signal is going to get passed on either to another neuron or to a target effector, which is going to be a muscle or a gland, in order to get a response. So in this case, again, the structure being many entry points in, but only one exit out. Now, neurons vary a lot in their structures. They vary depending on what they are, their function is. They vary in size from 4 micrometers to 100 micrometers in diameter. And their length actually varies from a few millimeters up to a meter. So they can be really long. This picture here shows you a connection between two different neurons. So again, most of the neurons organelles are in the cell body. That's where you're going to find the nucleus and the mitochondria and all the other organelles you would expect to find in an animal cell. And then most neurons are going to have many dendrites, which are highly branched extensions that receive the signals from other neurons. So here we have this second neuron with its dendrites receiving a signal from the first neuron right here. And the axon is typically a much longer extension right here that is transmitting the signal again to the next cell. And where the axon joins the cell body is called the axon hillock. Where we have the axon terminal or the synaptic terminal, we also have what is called a synapse. And that's the gap that we find. So these aren't necessarily touching each other. Cell to cell, there's actually a little gap that occurs called the synapse. So on this slide, you can see the different diversity among neurons depending on what their function is. So in this case here, we have interneurons, which are the ones found within the central nervous system that are involved in the processing of a signal and then translating that into a response, a motor response. So you'll see kind of a different structure here depending on where that interneuron is placed. Here we have a motor neuron, and you can see this is what we typically think of when we think of a neuron structure. We have the cell body up at the top with its dendrites, the axon coming down, and then the axon terminal here. And then this is a sensory neuron, which is going to look different, which is not actually very surprising. So in the case of a sensory neuron, we need something to receive the stimulus. So when you think of, for example, touch, when we feel that pressure, that's a particular type of sensory neuron, and it has a receptor cell attached to it at the top. And sometimes they'll actually even just have one dendron there to receive a signal so that we get a very specific signal from that a sensory neuron. And you'll see in this case the cell looks quite a bit different from a motor neuron because we actually have the axon come off from the receptor portion, and then the cell body is found somewhere in the middle. And then we have the axon continue, and then again we have our terminal area here, synaptic or axon terminal. So neurons use two types of signals to communicate. They use electrical signals, which we're going to study in depth, which are responsible for allowing the signal to travel a long distance. And then they also use chemical signals, which allow them to communicate with cells nearby. So this would be what's involved in, for example, the exchange at the synaptic junction. So the synapse is a junction between an axon and another cell, and the synaptic terminal of one axon passes the short distance signal information across the synapse in the form of a chemical messenger that's called a neurotransmitter. And then we'll look more carefully at different types of neurotransmitters in a bit. So fun facts about neurons. These are just some kind of interesting things. They're really considered the most specialized cell in animals, and for very important reasons because they have a very important job in controlling an organism's function in general as a whole. They're also the longest cell. In a blue whale, a neuron can actually be 30 meters. So we talked about 1 meter long, and in actuality, that's mostly in a human, that the most they'll be is a meter long. But in a blue whale, it can be actually 30 meters. Or in a giraffe, it can be 5 meters. And what I find even more amazing is how quickly they function. Because a nervous system can allow for a 1 millisecond response time. So the time it takes from the stimulus, for example, you touch something hot, to where it gets processed in the ganglia in the spinal cord and then causes you to pull your hand back, is just a very, very quick millisecond travel time